Welcome to the Christian Business Leader Podcast, where Christ-following business leaders explore God's will and ways for business. This show is a ministry of the Center for Christianity and Business at Houston Christian University and features conversations with today's Christ-centered business leaders who are representing Christ faithfully in the business world. I'm your host, Darren Shear, and if you want to make your work, leadership, and company's culture more Christ-centered, you've come to the right place. On this episode, we're joined by Don Golden. Don is the founder of Just Capital Quotient, which is dedicated to building life-giving economies worldwide by integrating integral business practices with Christian principles. He has over 30 years of experience in humanitarian contexts and as Chief Impact Officer at Threefold Private Equity. And we're going to be talking some about ESGs today. That's not all we're going to be talking about, but like Don and I were just talking about, typically when this term comes up, it's not always in the most positive light in Christian circles. But Don is going to share his perspective on this, and we'll see what the Scripture has to say about some of the underlying purpose behind this movement. So we'll see where this conversation goes. I'm excited to learn today. Don, welcome to the Theology of Business podcast.
Great to be with you. Thanks for having me, Darren.
Don, when did you first realize God wants to be involved in your work and business?
Oh, thank you. That's a good question. I think it's the other way around. I began to realize about 6 years ago, I wanted to get involved in God's work in the economy. I'd spent my life in ministry and in missions and then in humanitarian aid. And in the course of that work, I began to see the power of the economy in people's lives. You know, the gospel is a gospel to the poor. If it's not good news to the poor, it might not be good news. Mm-hmm. And so the idea that there's something happening in the economic arena, about 6 or 7 years ago, I wanted to make that switch, and the Lord opened up a door for me to be able to do that.
Because you were pastoring before, right? And then you made the transition.
Well, I've kind of worked in the whole range of professional evangelical Christianity, from the missionary world. I spent 10 years in Europe as a missionary. Then I came back to the U.S. and joined World Relief and served for 12 years with World Relief and World Vision, building partnerships between U.S. churches and crisis contexts around the world. I've traveled in over 80 countries doing this kind of aid and development work alongside churches. And then I also spent 3 years pastoring, and now also continue to serve in a part-time capacity at a church in Baltimore, Douglas Memorial Community Church.
Okay. And your company, Just Capital Quotient, helps companies, as I was reading on the website, you help companies uncover specific ESG needs. So for our listeners who might not be familiar, what is ESG, and what are the types of ESG needs you and your company seek to uncover?
Yeah, let's, websites don't always stay in touch with the language that we're using currently. And so there's a recent documentary by the Financial Times in London called The Death of ESG. Mm-hmm. It's fascinating. You Google it, check it out. Very interesting. ESG is a highly politicized term, and at best, it's a program that corporations implement to address their use of natural capital. But from the theological, from the impact, and actually from the standpoint of what matters most, the issue of using what God has given us well for the well-being of humanity, for people, and for this garden that God has given us to live in. My interests along the line of ESG really resides there. Now, for companies, and many of the companies I consult for working in the built environment, there's a lot happening, a lot of change happening. For example, in the arena of waste. I don't know how you are, but I just went to Chipotle today, and I come out with a massive collection of paper and plastic and waste, and we create so much waste. So one way that companies are innovating and winning in the market is learning to deal with the problem of waste. So actually, I think the convergence between a better, more regenerative use of natural resources and innovation in the market, there's a really interesting overlap there. And one thing that I help business leaders do, Christian business leaders, is to find their position around the use of natural resources, not allow CNN to define it for you or Fox News to define it for you, but what scripture say about our role as stewards of the planet? And what do you see as your business's opportunity to innovate in positive ways in that arena? So that's just a little bit about the environment and ESG.
Got it. And so, but ESG stands for environmental, social, governance,
and
right?
governance. Yeah, that's right. That's right.
Right. And so the social piece and the governance piece, how do you explain that?
Yeah, well, so social, one of the things that undergirds the approach to operationalizing a business that is more positively impactful, that is a good expression of our stewardship as kingdom leaders, is what we call a multi-capitals framework. And that really just asks, well, what are all the things that we put into a business to create wealth? Well, we know we put financial capital, but there's also human capital, and there's social capital, and there's natural capital. And so what we do is look at that multi-capitals framework, and we ask ourselves, how can we become more creative, more positively impactful, and win in the market through better solutions to profitable problem solving? How can we solve problems that people have in a profitable way that is stewarding those multi-capitals in a positive way? And so when you think of social capital, you're really talking about the communities in which we work and the communities of people that make up our labor force, for example, or our customers, for example. And so how we trade in that social capital, does our business create trust in communities? Do people trust us? Do they trust our solutions, our services, our products? So that's honoring that social capital, trying to be an agent of reconciliation. One of this idea in theology that's so powerful of shalom, one of the issues of fallen human sinful humanity is our separation from ourself, from the other, from the environment, ultimately because of our separation from God. And so the reconciliation, as Paul says in Colossians 1:20, the reconciliation in Christ of all things. We want to make sure our businesses are not profiting off of causing problems in communities, but actually building trust and solving problems for communities. So that in the ESG, even though I don't talk now a lot about ESG and should address my website, but we do want in the S side. The governance side really is about ownership, for example, making sure that profits that are created are properly distributed. I don't mean redistributed necessarily. Whatever program you use, the main problem that we have today in the economy is that too much of the money that's made is going to the top of the treehouse. I don't know if you ever saw that. There's a kid's cartoon about going to the stuff mart and buying a lot of stuff. This was Veggie Tales, and they used to show it to my kids. And they, bring all the stuff home to the treehouse, and eventually the treehouse is going to tip over because you got too much stuff from the stuff mart. Well, a lot of our businesses, it's not about making money. Make money, but make sure that the business is governed and structured in a way that wealth can be distributed through to other people, so that more people get jobs, that more people get a positive prospect on the future for their lives. So governance has to do with how is the business managed in a way that it is just for others.
And so typically in the conversations I have, when we start to talk about what companies are getting it right from a biblical perspective, the ones that come top of mind for a lot of people would be like Hobby Lobby, Chick-fil-A, C12 is an incredible organization with a very large network of companies whose leaders are really trying to get it right biblically. Who would be an example of a company that you believe is getting it right from a biblical standpoint?
Yeah, well, I mean, I have to. You mentioned some excellent examples there. The bit I know about those companies, certainly Hobby Lobby and Chick-fil-A, that I know a lot about. But my focus has been small and medium enterprises, and the companies say between 10 and 100 million. That size of companies, a lot of freedom that business owners in that arena have. Corporations, obviously, it's harder at times to turn the ship and to make choices. But so I'd happily speak about the company where I serve as chief impact officer. It's a bit self-serving that my business had took on this client, and they've taken me on onto their executive team as chief impact officer. And so I get to work out these principles with Charlie Meyer and Mark Riggle at an Indianapolis-based private equity holding company called Threefold. And under their leadership, they've made a very strong commitment. They hired me to say, we're on our way to making a lot of money, and we want to make sure that as we make that money, we do it in a way that it has kingdom impact. So they gave me the task of, what does kingdom impact mean? And for more than 4 years now, we've been working that out, and that's where this idea of a multi-capitals approach came from. I can just give a quick shout out to Jay Jacob, a book called The Economics of Mutuality.
Yeah, I interviewed him on this show.
Oh, okay. Well, then Jay. So that model, he's committed to this multi-capitals approach. But let me step back and do a little theology, if I may, where we got this idea. The first story that is told after the fall of humanity is the story of Cain and Abel. And if you look at that story, it's actually at the heart, it's an economic story, because you have the separation of humans from God. And then you have two brothers in the field. One is a farmer, one is a shepherd. They both need the same field for productive purposes. And so that separation from God brings the myth of scarcity. There's not enough to go around. And the myth of scarcity leads to the myth of redemptive violence. I have to kill you to protect what is mine. And those two myths, to me, is the Bible saying all of history is going to be framed by this economic crisis, that there's not enough to go around. And as a result, people kill one another. So I'm going to build a reconciling people who will operate from abundance. And so if you could imagine, instead of Cain killing Abel, if you could imagine him sitting down and beginning to work out, hey, we both need this. We both need this field. We both have needs, and the multi-capitals framework just sort of breaks down what are the needs that we have in our businesses. So you have financial capital, you have human capital, you have social capital, and you have natural capital. These are all the gifts that God has given us to use in the wealth creating process. And what we can do when we're animated by the Spirit of God and we're coming from a place of abundance is the creative, innovative stewardship of those capitals for the well-being of others. How can we use this business and all that it does to bring good into the world? We call this intrinsic impact. Intrinsic impact means that the good that we want for the world is done through the business and as a natural outcome of business operations. In other words, the history of doing good in business has often been, we'll make money, we'll take the largesse, the extra that we create, and we'll go do good through charity. But intrinsic impact says, okay, charity is good, we have to be charitable, but what we really need to do is make sure that our businesses are having a positive impact on people and on our environment through the very natural processes of the business. And so Threefold Private Equity and the painting companies, the coating companies, the roofing company that they own, they have begun to not only take on these learnings, but begin to see how they can start to give us competitive advantage in the marketplace. So people choose us actually because of the good that we're bringing into the world, both for people, for the environment, for the products and services that we're bringing. So there's a number of businesses that are part of this. Renovia, a wonderful painting company in Indianapolis, White Hat Industrial, it's a roofing company, and they've created a way to coat roofing, to do roofing in a way that is incredibly positive for the environment. You know, the number 2 item in landfills in America are roof tear-offs.
Really?
So you take a roof, you put it on, maybe then you put another roof on top of that. Maybe it lasts 40 years. You take that big rubber roof off of an industrial building, you put it in the ground, it takes 400,000 years for it to biodegrade.
Wow.
But with this, but White Hat is using a spray polyurethane roofing solution that you use that old roof as a substrate. You turn the roof white. It cools the roof. It reduces waste to landfill. It's a tremendous alternative. It's really a revolution in roofing, and it costs less than a quarter of tearing the roof off and putting another one on. So that's an example where a business is doing good for people, doing good for the planet, doing good in the name of Christ, and innovating and winning in the market.
Yeah, I love that example. What are some of those other specific kind of non-obvious examples that are that you could highlight from some of the other, I guess these are portfolio companies of...
Yeah, let me give you another one. In my business, Just Capital Quotient, we also have an investment arm. So we're trying to put money into starting awesome new businesses that are engaged in what Jay Jacob and EOM calls profitable problem solving. And one is in Rwanda, a place that I know well. I've spent many of my years with World Relief traveling in that part of the world. And a man named Ray Power has a business called Power Resources International, and they are mining rare earth minerals in Rwanda. And the history of mining rare earth minerals in Africa is a pretty gruesome story of injustice. You know, going to Eastern Congo, extracting conflict, what they call conflict minerals, taking that wealth, and then taking it to China and America, where you actually add the value to it and where people get wealthy. In Rwanda, Power Resources International is mining tantalum, which is, by the way, the rarest rare earth mineral, not only on Earth, but in the entire solar system. And it's super highly sought for what they call fail-free circuitry. So everybody in the world wants this, but it's found in Africa, this particular Great Lakes portion of Africa. So the great scramble, how do we get it out and take it from those Africans and bring it to China or America? But Ray Power has said, okay, I'm going to do this mining, but I'm going to build a refinery. And so that means all of the technical expertise, all of the training, all of the education, all of the value add shifts from China and the US into Africa itself. Mm-hmm. And so that is just one of the amazing examples where a Christ-motivated founder sees an opportunity. You could make a lot more money just by extracting it and doing it the way that everybody else has done. But instead, he's put all his energy into bringing, and it is not easy. This is some of the most challenging engineering that you can do. He's bringing that to Africa, and they're up and producing and selling refined tantalum powder. But the benefits are pouring in so many different ways to Rwanda because of what Ray has done. So that's another example.
How do they stay competitive with the companies that try to do it the cheap and easy way?
Yeah, well, that's the risk. And I would say that when you look at kingdom businesses, risk is one of the things that we begin to recognize as something that we need to be taking. I think taking risks that we know are innovative and beneficial to the human family, that are good representatives of what God wants us to be and do in the world, are the kind of risks we ought to be taking. And what you often find is that taking those calculated competitive risks often helps you find even cheaper ways to do things. So that's what Ray is doing to access this tantalum and putting all the effort in up front. The back end side is going to actually make it cheaper for him to bring tantalum to the market.
Yeah.
Once he overcomes all those barriers that he's had to go through to get all of that technical capacity into Rwanda.
Yeah. Well, sometimes the more environmental or what seems to be the more environmentally friendly option it is more profitable, such as the examples that you shared with the roof substrate and everything. But with, for example, let's completely eliminate fossil fuels and shift to everything is now battery powered. What is your take on that philosophy?
Yeah. I don't like to. We have a world that we have to move forward with, and what we want to do is to move redemptively. That's another principle that we talked about. Redemptive movement, redemption in general, just the idea of taking on risk, giving yourself away for the benefit of others. But if you think about a redemptive horizon, you might look at an industry and say, right now, this industry is causing harm, but we need fuel. So it's causing harm. And I don't think it's wise for Christians to deny science and to deny facts, but to actually honor God by saying, "Hey, we are." It took a long time for these fossil fuels to be created, and we're burning a lot of them up and putting all that carbon back in the environment. And all I know is, in my 57 years, I don't think we have stewarded this garden very well. I always ask all my clients, when you take a vacation, where do you like to go? And I always talk about mountains and lakes and rivers. And so are those things better now than they were 50 years ago or not? And so the question is just really, how do we in our industry trust that if this is something we have to do, then the God of creation, the God of infinite creativity, will give us ways to do it in more life-giving ways. So, the transition to alternative energy sources, absolutely. Let's go after them all, but let's do it from a spirit of abundance, creativity, joy, and win in the market, because we're kind of out loving the world. And we're being honest about what we see and not denying. We're not trying to fight the culture wars, and that's not help. That's not reconciling. That's not being, the city set on a hill, which people go to find, oh, you're the ones that can help us settle our conflicts. Christians are often right in the middle, slinging elbows, causing conflict. And we don't want to be that. That's not the way of Christ in the world. So I think a redemptive horizon is to say, first of all, is what we're doing exploiting people or planet right now? And in some cases, it just is. That actually one of the things that I help clients do is to get really honest, to say, what are the dirty little secrets and the animal spirits unleashed in your industry? And rather than not, we don't want to talk about, no, look at them, look at that, like the roofing thing. 40 years with one roof that you put in the ground that takes 400,000 to degrade. And it's the number 2 item in American landfill. Some states refuse to have roofing waste. You have to ship it to another state and pay that state to put it into the ground. That can't be a good thing. But by looking head on at that, oh, wow, there's a different solution. There's creativity, there's innovation, there's opportunity to win in the market. So I think, are we being exploited? Well, how can we move to an ethical approach? And then from the ethical, how might we move to a more regenerative, to give back more to people and planet than we take? Find ways that start giving back. And actually, that's to me the exciting thing that's happening. One of the reasons I don't like to engage the culture wars is I like to find the people that are creating real solutions where you just sort of see the light and beauty of the divine, God's love, coming into the world, into new solutions. So I think that redemptive frame, that movement from, is it exploitation? Okay, then what can we do to move it more towards an ethical footing? And then what possibilities lie in the future for more creative and regenerative or sustainable ways that can last and provide better solutions, more life-giving solutions?
Yes, the earth is the Lord's and all it contains. We do need to
Amen.
do a much, much better job of stewarding our planet. So we've talked mostly about the E of the ESG. So the S, the social, as I understand it, DEI, another fun acronym, is kind of a subset of that S. Correct me if I'm wrong, but it stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Inclusion.
Um,
Yeah.
why do you think companies like Walmart, Lowe's, Tractor Supply are now, I mean, there was this really aggressive DEI movement, uh, but they're now sort of, a lot of these companies are starting to backpedal
Yeah,
from that.
yeah. Whenever an institution gets hold of anything, it usually gets reduced to its, I don't know, it's maybe its worst common denominator. So those are both just two terms I don't use a whole
Mhm.
lot anymore. But let's just think about diversity, equity. I mean, equity as God's people. Read Second Corinthians chapter 7. What Paul lays out when he takes a snapshot of all the churches in the Mediterranean, basically all the churches of the world, and he says, I don't want you to suffer so that they can thrive. I just want there to be equity. I've spent my whole life working with churches around the world in 80 countries. I can tell you, if Paul were to see the inequity that exists even in one city between our churches, he would be appalled. He would take our church leaders to task because there's no equity. We've learned. I was just in South Africa. One day I'm in Kailiche, one of the poorest, largest slums, human settlements on the planet. 2 days later, I'm in an exclusive golf community with only white people being served by only black people. And I just thought, is this 1950 or is this 2024, a few weeks ago? So I don't know that we need DEI because it's a highly politicized, programmatic political tool that's bannered about, and not necessarily helpful. But do we need equity? Oh, do we need diversity? Do we need to hear voices that are coming from the margins into our lives and into our power centers? Absolutely. There's studies about the resilience that are built into communities when they're not all the same, but when they have that kind of, and then and inclusiveness. I think one of the facts, and this relates to equity as well, that the income inequality right now is not good and it is not healthy. The percentage of every new dollar made and how much of it goes to those who already have many dollars. And a study of history will tell you that every empire that has fallen, wealth inequality has been part of what has torn apart the fabric. And it's not in keeping with the spirit of Jesus, and I think that's why Paul's so passionate about that there would be equity. He shames the church of Corinth to look at the church of Macedonia to look how they gave out of their need so he could take up this collection for the poor churches in Jerusalem so that the world would look at the church and say, there's inequity in the world, but look at the church. But I don't think the church has just done enough to fight that issue. And instead, we've been hijacked by political voices who have used us for reasons that have not been in our kingdom interests. Did I
So,
almost start preaching there? Did I
yeah.
start to get a little preacher tone going?
So, one of the main ways that I've seen DEI really advanced in the marketplaces through something like affirmative action, where we're going to give hiring preference to a particular group because of their skin color, because of their sexual orientation, like the Corporate Equality Index is trying to promote. And as I try to think about what would be a biblical case for this that could potentially be made for something like affirmative action, it's hard for me to see that. I mean, I see, for example, the principle of the gleanings. So for any listeners that might not be familiar, this was written into uh, the Mosaic law that you were to leave the corners of your fields for the poor and the foreigners to come and glean. I mean, they would have to do the work. They would have to do the harvesting. And, famously, this is how Ruth meets Boaz and is part of the lineage of Jesus. But in terms of, we're going to give hiring preference to this particular group because, historically they are, or that they're currently a minority, or historically they've been mistreated in some way. Like, is there a biblical case to be made?
Well, you know what, you're pulling out these very challenging issues, and I appreciate that. The context that I would come at answering this question: I serve as a minister at the historic Douglas Memorial Community Church in West Baltimore, which is an African American church. We actually celebrate our 100th anniversary this year. Thurgood Marshall was when Brown versus Board of Education, when that legislation passed, our church was a centerpiece for that case to be made in the city of Baltimore. So we have a long history. Our previous pastor is Raphael Warnock. Before he went to Ebenezer, he was our pastor at Douglas. And I can only say that I tell people that I became a white man when I joined Douglas Memorial Church. I didn't really understand what it meant to be white until I gained some proximity towards a community that doesn't share my skin color. And so all I can say is that affirmative action has been an important way for I'll give you an example. One of the women in my weekly care call that I lead every week, when in 1953, she was a part of one of the first cohorts to go to Boston College in affirmative action. And one of the men in her cohort was a man named Martin Luther King Jr. And my sister Eloise in my weekly meeting went to school to Boston University with Martin Luther King Jr. and became, she's the first PhD in social work in the state of Maryland. And so all I can say is that many who have benefited from affirmative action have become incredible leaders and assets to their community. And I think it's, once again, we, God's people, we know how to do these things well in the spirit of life and community. I don't think the Democrats or the Republicans, anytime this sort of good intention thing becomes a policy, it ends up distorting into its worst common denominator, its worst form. So people who don't like it, I understand. But I also know how important it remains, as do the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65. These are still important pillars to the freedoms that African Americans have achieved. I would like to see us as God's people be less partisan and more principally policy. In other words, how do we come together and argue and demand right policies, just policies, and not become the tools of political parties who often are just using us to get power and to take it in directions that are not that helpful. I don't know if that was a very good discussion or good answer, but that's my connection to your question.
Right. Yeah. Well, I'm really curious about how you make a biblical case for something like affirmative action. Again, I can see the principle of the gleanings. I mean, there's always going to be examples and exceptions that we can use to kind of justify a particular policy. But, on this show, we're trying to look at what would be a scriptural basis for it. And typically, when this topic comes up, we're going to go to like the parable of the talents and sort of evidence of some merit-based principles that we can kind of hang our hat on to understand how we do hiring and how we do promotions at work and so like what do you look to scripturally?
Well, at the core of our mandate as God's people, it is the reconciliation, the redemption of all things, to put back together what is broken, what is not working, what is separated, what is separated from God, separated from one another in creation. And in that spirit of seeking to be agents of healing in the world, our primary guide is the way of the cross. And the way of the cross, that is self-giving love, that is altruism. And so I can absolutely see one group saying, not only did we have some great opportunities, Native American communities having, suffered a genocide at the hands of our ancestors, and Black Americans having had their labor stolen. There's so much unaddressed history that I think some of us, especially those of us who are willing to make a sacrifice for others, there's an argument to be made there about giving yourself and your opportunities away for the benefit of others, especially those who have been denied the kinds of opportunities that you've been given. When you turn that over into a policy and you hand that policy to the state, will it operate from that altruistic principle? Very unlikely. So that's our dilemma. And one of the reasons that I love personally working with small and medium businesses is that the power that a business leader owns to be able to bring justice, to make decisions, to take a chance on someone, not giving up commitments to excellence, but to be able to give people opportunities and to find ways to find hidden value in people. There's tremendous power that small and medium businesses have to operate under those redemptive principles that I don't think our governments could really be expected to operate in altruistic ways.
Yeah, and it's a dilemma too, because it's not so much the lawmakers' altruism that is on display as it is they're taking away one, because to take one job and give it to somebody, you're taking it away from somebody else inevitably, right? And in this case, it would be based on race, color, sexual orientation. I'm referring to the corporate equality index, where these companies are getting scored on a scale of 1 to 100, and one of those items is, do you have hiring initiatives specifically targeted toward LGBTQ? And so that's it. It's not just a matter of you're laying down your life, you're laying down your job, your opportunity for somebody else, as it is a lawmaker saying, we're going to force you to lay down your opportunity, and we're going to take that and give it to somebody else. And it's just, I mean, to me, it's hard to make a scriptural argument for that, is it not?
Yeah, this is not an arena in which I operate.
Gotcha. So, and thank you for your grace in tolerating some of these really tough questions that like I said, if things like this come up on this show, it's typically you're typically going to get the party line. So I'm curious.
Yeah, what I'm interested in as a consultant and a coach to kingdom-oriented small and medium business owners is the freedom that they enjoy not to have to submit to those types of impositions, whether that's viewed as positive or negative. what I think we're able to go really to the core of the issue and say, how do I bring life to the wealth making process? And we've created a framework in which we now don't have to deal with ESG because we are building much more environmentally integrous businesses. We don't even have to, no one's scoring us around ESG. We're just busy thinking about how do you code a building in a way that's more life-giving, and how do you win in the market because of that? That's exciting.
Yes.
Oh, and by the way, it's got good ESG scores. But we don't even think about that. We're thinking about, I think, because humans must coat the buildings they live in, then the God who made us this way is going to give us the creativity to do it in a way that doesn't harm the planet.
Yeah.
And maybe right now what we're doing is harming the planet. So we don't have to tear it all down. Let's get creative. Let's trust God and let's get in there and get creative. But the same applies to diversity. I'm in too many environments in which it's not diverse enough. And there's a sense of, wow, I know that because I'm a minister at a Black church, I now don't trust any room that all looks the same, because I just know you're not going to hear that perspective here. And so I'm always wanting to be that one who's like, oh, where's that other voice? And, how do we make sure that we have a good picture of this issue that we're dealing with? Let's build a more diverse environment. And when you find them and they're working well, not imposed. I have a nephew that works in corporate America, and he'd be vehemently saying, this has been terrible for me, and I watch that and I just feel bad for him. And then I get to work with businesses that have the freedom to handle these things in ways that are good for them, and yet to be challenged. How do you build diversity, and what does it do for your business, et cetera? I mean, one of the issues that we deal with is contract labor, which is 99.9% Hispanic. And, many, many businesses depend on that workforce. And that's a particularly vulnerable community, and probably going to become more vulnerable in the months to come. And, how do we deal with that? And that's one that, is very, very pressing to many of my clients. And, so we're all thrust into these ethical dilemmas that I think there is a way through them. And it's always nice when we don't have to deal with somebody pushing a policy down our throat.
Yeah. Yeah. I have to brag on my 10-year-old son. He asked for a smelting furnace for Christmas. And so we got it for him. And he's to do smelting, you're going to need some metal. Right. And so we have a creek in our backyard. He's been going up and down that creek and has found dozens and dozens of littered aluminum cans that have ended up in the creek, has totally cleaned up the creek of aluminum cans, at least.
Amazing.
And has now
That's
been
awesome.
using those for his smelting project. But, it wasn't necessarily, let me figure out how to go and clean up the environment. It was, I have an interest in, so, that maybe we've got to figure out more creative ways to incentivize.
Well, see that word creative, think about that again, that Genesis 1-3 and then Genesis 4. Creator creates creation, and we are part of that creation, and we are his image bearers. And so that creator creates creation that continues to create. It's a very Jewish concept that humans join God in the unfolding work of creation. So we're continuing to create the world. Romans frames it the new Adam for the new creation. And what I like to put into between is, how did the new Adam get to the new creation? It's through a new economy. It's very interesting that Acts chapter 7, the very first martyr of the church, he's martyred after he quotes Isaiah 61. And that verse is, heaven is my throne, the earth is my footstool. What kind of house will you build me? And that question angers the religious leaders so much that they murder Stephen. Why is that? I did a lot of study on that verse. What kind of house will you build me? Well, in Greek, that word house is oikos, where we get the word economy. If you were to hear that question in Greek, it would say, what kind of economy will you build me? Well, when you start talking about economy, people start to get threatened. And so these leaders, we don't want a new economy. So I think a new Adam, those who come to Christ, working for a new creation. Romans chapter 8, all of creation is groaning in eager expectation for these new Adams to be revealed, the sons and daughters of God. But this new economy, this new house, building an economy that is just, that is inclusive, that is regenerative, whether we like those terms or not, who cares? But that is our responsibility, to build an economy that brings more, where the poor can say, wow, I have a place, I have a future. Where the earth that's crying out can say, wow, these stewards of the planet really know how to use these resources well, like your son is learning to do. Like, I love this place. I'm out here. I'm getting this metal. I'm doing this thing. Look, the creek is better. That's a beautiful thing. So all of that to say that creativity, a good term in business, is innovation. What does the market need that's not there? And one of the interesting things is that there is, while ESG gets battered around, that documentary I told you about, Who Killed ESG, the punchline of that documentary is ESG is dead, but the pressures on the planet for better stewarding, treating the resources we have better, isn't going away. It can't go away. There's too many problems. There's too many of us. We have to learn to steward the planet, and creativity is the way that I think we can build innovative businesses.
Well said, Don. I really appreciate your heart for the Lord, for people, for God's creation. And thank you for sharing your wisdom with us today on some really difficult, controversial topics. I've found it really
my pleasure.
insightful.
My pleasure. It's always a joy.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Christian Business Leader Podcast. Be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and tune in for the next episode as we continue exploring God's will and ways for business.